work, which hopefully Leah will cover. And equity has now become one of the four pillars of our regional planning framework. Housing, transportation, particularly around high capacity transit and climate change and equity are kind of the key four pillars of our regional planning framework. But I am not an expert on equity or EJ. It's a big piece of our work, but Leah Boggs has done most of the work on it within our group. So I'll turn it over to Leah, and she'll share what she can on this topic. So thanks, Leah.
Thank you, Jeff, and making sure that everyone can hear me very clearly. I can get a thumbs up or a yes. That would be great. Okay, great. Yes. So yes, as Jeff mentioned, I am on the Climate and Energy AIR team, along with some other members that you may have met or heard their names before as well. Maya Davis, Tim Masters, who I think is also on the line, and Katie Dyer. But yes, as Jeff mentioned, I don't think anyone really could call themselves a expert in environmental justice or even equity, even coming from sort of a a BIPOC sort of community member. No one is an expert because it's structural. So we all are in this sort of learning phase of how to manage and navigate through how to work through environmental justice and equity and racial and social equity in the work that we do every day at COG and throughout the region and through the county. So Dawn, if you could share my presentation, that would greatly be appreciated.
Yeah.
And so what I will share with you today, it will not be sort of an exhaustive look at all things environmental justice and equity. It's just sort of a teaser, is just to give you an idea of what's out there, the tools that you may be able to employ in the work that you do. Next slide, please. And so what I'll go through is sort of pretty much what we've done at COG at the board level, and as well through the planning areas, specifically with climate, energy, and air. So here, back in July 2020, the COG board of the directors sort of looked at, sort of the what was happening globally, and obviously what was happening at the time with the sort of righteous rebellion of uprising that happened in 2020, the summer of 2020, and declared that equity was going to be a fundamental value with what we do at COG throughout our programs and also internally. And so, the COG board affirmed that equity would be woven throughout everything that COG would do. And you'll see further sort of at the COG board level, as well as in our planning areas, what we actually started before 2020, how equity and environmental justice is being sort of a nexus of where we need to kind of move forward in the region. Next slide, please. And so here, this is kind of what I was getting to in terms of equity at the COG board level. As you know, sort of the metropolitan planning framework for 2030, it just came out in this past year. It is sort of a progress over the last 10 years. We've made a lot of progress, specifically in the energy and climate area. We've increased the number of high performance buildings from under 1,000 to over 5,000, the number of grid connected renewables from 500 in 2009 to over 50,000 in 2020, as well as, sort of EV or even hybrid vehicle ownership has increased. But even with those strides made, it was made clear that our region needs to collaborate to reach growing challenges in the housing, homelessness, and how to adequately sort of and equitably address the needs of the region's citizens. So between 2020, the region is between 2020 and 2030, the region is expected to grow by almost 60,000 people, and more than 400,000 jobs would be needed. And so in the past, recent years, COG board sort of sharpens its focus onto sort of interrelated challenges, and in 2020 endorsed a set of planning priorities that would lay out how we would grow forward, how would we reach these goals over the next 10 years related to equity, transit, land use, housing, homelessness, climate, and energy. And so this is in line with what the board declared in terms of equity being the central focus or the region's mission. And so one of the priority areas is equity, is built on sort of the equity emphasis areas, or moving forward, I'll shorten it by saying EAAs. So the equity emphasis areas is a planning concept to evaluate equity and inform future growth. The methodology for these EAAs was originally adopted at the National Capital Region Transportation Planning Board back in 2017. And so there are 4 planning areas, equity being one of them, but the other 3 planning areas is high capacity transit, housing targets for 2030, and of course, 2030 greenhouse gas emission goals, and the action plan, which you all may be familiar with, which I'll explain a little later. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so this is just a graphical explanation of what the EAAs are. Again, it's a planning concept to evaluate equity. There's approximately 350 equity emphasis areas in the region. Region has about 1,200 census tracts. The areas with high concentrations of underserved residents, which are low income, Black and African American, Asian and Hispanic and Latino citizens. The EAAs are found region-wide, and there's nearly 30% of the region's population resides in equity emphasis areas. Next slide, please. So here is just a graphical representation of what that 2030 framework looks like. Again, these planning priorities are put together in terms of actions. And so we'll be using this 2030 framework again to sort of implement across all planning areas within COG: transportation, housing, safety, climate and energy, and air, how we are going to move forward with specifically those 4 planning areas, but especially in terms of equity. Next slide, please. And so again, these are just the broader concepts of what equity emphasis areas will focus on: housing, community planning, health, resiliency is one of them, as well as climate and energy, and education. And economic opportunities is a large component as well. We need to sort of, you'll hear this throughout sort of my presentation, that we need to sort of look more holistically and have more wraparound ideas in terms of how we are looking at building community resiliency, building social and racial equity, and sort of upliftment of all community members. Next slide, please. So this finally is just another sort of areas of equity emphasis at the COG board level. We have GARE, which is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity cohorts. I think some of the county's members may have participated in these cohorts. We've had a couple since 2019. We've had two cohorts since 2019. Their regional learning cohorts for local government staff to advance racial equity and opportunities. We did not have one this year. We plan to have one in 2023. We're looking at sort of retooling or sort of a re-emphasis on how those cohorts will be developed. They were first sort of developed with an idea of sort of a 101 sort of focus on equity. So now that the local governments are sort of familiar with it, we're looking to sort of have sort of tiered levels of cohorts. Those available that is the first time training in terms of social and racial equity. And then we're looking to sort of have a more advanced cohort available to local government members. So the 2030 cohort is sort of under development. And then we also had racial equity learning series. This was the first time we've had a workshop back in May of 2022 through, it just ended in September. There will be some follow-up workshops to consider ways to support jurisdictions to commit advancing racial equity. These racial equity learning series, again, is for elected officials. We also would be sort of focusing on these equity learning series on those policymakers. So the cohorts are focused on all local government staff, and then the learning series was focused on the policymakers. Next slide, please. And finally, the Chief Equity Officers Committee. This committee was formed back in 2021. Again, focused on centering equity. They are focused on advancing racial equity, not only within COG programs in our communities, but also in the jurisdictions. A lot of what the chief equity officers look at is sort of a top-down approach to social and racial equity. Its representation is made up of racial equity managers, designated staff within the local governments. We're looking to continue that formation until, I would say until, a racial equity focused committee is no longer needed. How long that would be, we don't know, but that's sort of my idea of if we're centering equity. I guess the best metric that I would say is when having, a committee focused on racial equity is no longer needed, meaning there's no longer discrimination based on social and racial terms. And so again, this Chief Equity Officers Committee is more or less focused on a large planning concept across jurisdictions, looking at budgets for training, looking at budgets for specific planning purposes in equity in each of the planning areas. And so they also, at the beginning of the formation of the committee, they came up with a definition which was used or developed by GARE for racial equity, and that is when race can no longer be used to predict life outcomes and outcomes. Oh, that's a typo there. To predict life outcomes. Oh, and outcomes for all groups are improved. And so this is the working definition that the chief equity officers are moving with and what was presented to the COG board. So this is what we're using across COG in terms of racial equity. And next slide, please. And then finally, let's get into sort of the details of equity and environmental justice in climate, energy, and air. The 2017 Environmental Justice Toolkit, and then the 2030 Climate and Energy Action Plan. The EJ Toolkit is a pivotal publication led by COG's Air and Climate Public Advisory Committee, or ACPAC, back in 2017. it identified equity and EJ as a top priority and has remained a top priority since that time. And so as you can see, we've been working, and then as Jeff mentioned, we've been working on environmental justice for a very long time. Not quite long, but over 2 years before the pandemic. And so it's been sort of bubbling up in terms of in the Department of Environmental Programs, and it's expanded in terms of development of the equity emphasis areas. The EJ Toolkit played a very important role in development of those equity emphasis areas. And so, in terms of what ACPAC is and who those citizen advisory committee members are. The committee is an advisory committee that advises CEPC and MWAC on climate, energy, and air issues. I think most may be familiar with CEPC, the Climate, Energy, and Air Policy Committee, as well as MWAC, the Metropolitan Washington Air Quality Committee. Both of these are policy committees. And the Public Advisory Committee advises those committees. They're made up of 6 members per jurisdiction or main jurisdiction: Maryland, DC, and Virginia. The Prince George's County does have a citizen represented on ACPAC. So the county does have input. And so in 2016, that toolkit was developed by that body. It set the stage for COG to begin incorporating equity into all the work that we do. The committee provided, again, input on the equity emphasis areas. Early on, we began addressing the priority of equity emphasis by sort of getting input and research on environmental justice advocates in the region. And then out of that, the environmental toolkit was developed. And then the 2030 Climate and Energy Action Plan. As most of you know, the 2030 plan sets mitigation and resiliency goals for the region, which are 50% greenhouse gas emission reductions based on the 2005 baseline, and to be climate ready by 2030. So this was a big undertaking that the climate and energy team undertook in 2019. It was published in 2020. And now we're in the implementation phase of the Climate, Energy, and Action Plan. The plan has sort of 35 collaborative actions, 25 mitigation, and 10 dedicated to resiliency. Each of those have equity areas, and then there are very specific equity areas woven into, dedicated to equity in the plan. So in terms of mapping, I will sort of work or describe a bit more about equity emphasis areas and then get into the tools of the environmental justice toolkit. Next slide, please. And so these equity emphasis areas and mapping, we identified energy burden, heat island, flood, and sea level rise in mapping in our mapping work of our climate planning 2030 plan. So energy burden, I do want to start sort of looking at giving you definitions of what sort of environmental justice is, energy burden, what energy justice is, what vulnerable populations are. Those are important terms to sort of be clear in terms of developing equity. So energy burden, or the percentage of household income that goes towards energy costs, were overlaid for these equity emphasis areas. So in terms of mapping, when we started our work in equity emphasis areas, we overlaid this energy burden with the equity emphasis areas. So these equity emphasis areas spend a large portion of their income on home energy costs. We found that the mean energy burden in equity emphasis areas is 6.6% higher than all other census tracts. And so then we also mapped in terms of extreme heat. We found that heat is the #1 cause of weather-related injuries and fatalities in the region. We found that the EAAs are slightly higher or heavily burdened by extreme heat. The median number of heat extreme days a year that people experience in the region is about 8.61 days. However, the median is 8.75 days. So we're seeing that in mapping these equity emphasis areas in certain areas with energy burden, heat island effects, we're seeing that vulnerable communities within these equity emphasis areas are sort of getting impacted detrimentally. We also looked at flooding in mapping these equity emphasis areas. We found that FEMA's 100-year floodplains run more than 60% in these equity emphasis areas, where currently approximately 1 million people reside within the region. Also noteworthy is that more than half of the region's EAAs are within the Anacostia watershed, where there's significant flooding occurs. And so we know that the Anacostia area, of DC is one of those vulnerable communities where there's high rates of poverty, high rates of unemployment. There's also an area where there's a high number of Black and underserved communities. Next slide, please. And so these are just some definitions that we should be, become more familiar with. Energy justice is a concept that embraces the principles that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection under the environmental law. It means fair treatment of all people, regardless of race, color, and nationality. It requires stakeholder involvement in the implementation and enforcement of environmental laws. Many of these definitions we got either from US EPA or Initiative for Energy Justice. And energy justice is the goal of achieving equity in both the social and economic participation in the energy system, by also remediating social, economic, and health burdens in these disproportionately harmed by the energy system. And then there's vulnerable communities, which are populations identified using demographic and environmental indicators, including exposure to air pollution, water pollution, and waste management. Pollutions with a historically disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards. So when we developed these equity emphasis areas, we had all of this in mind in ensuring that we captured communities that were overly represented in disparate metrics in terms of high rates of asthma, high rates of unemployment. They also represent folks that have English as a second language. They also represent folks, again, that have a high energy burden. Next slide, please. And so, yes, these are the sort of elements that typically are represented in vulnerable communities, low income, minority, marginalized groups. It also includes marginalized groups, can also include people with disabilities, people with chronic health problems, elderly children. people with limited English proficiency. So these are the communities that we're trying to support with the work we do in terms of environmental justice. Next slide, please. So let's get into the 2017 Environmental Justice Toolkit. Again, this was a toolkit developed by the Air and Climate Public Advisory Committee. We developed this toolkit to be a resource or a guide for policymakers on incorporating social equity, cultural sensitivity, and community health concerns. And so we developed an approach with looking at 9 areas of identifying or tools that policymakers can use in sort of evaluating their work for equity and environmental justice. So approach 1, identifying potentially vulnerable populations. Again, we went through what those vulnerable populations could look like. Policymakers are specifically tasked with sort of rigorous work of applying fair treatment in education, engagement, permitting, citing decisions. This means specifically mapping those locations of local residents and how they could be affected by vulnerable or environmental pollution and policies. So again, it's important that we keep what environmental justice is, what energy justice is, what vulnerable communities include. And so policymakers are tasked with identifying what those populations are. Approach 2 would be providing meaningful engagement opportunities. So once potentially vulnerable populations are identified, local policymakers are, I had a pop up, local policymakers are encouraged to provide meaningful engagement opportunities. Increasingly, local governments, policymakers are recognizing the value of in-depth engagement and dialogue with communities, and even require it in many instances. So it's important that, we not only kind of look at who the vulnerable populations are, but we're providing meaningful engagement with them. That can mean, oftentimes we're going to communities and sort of providing them what our ideas of what a good community looks like, what economic development looks like, what their needs are. But it's important for us to sort of, not only once we identify them, that we give these communities a voice at sort of mapping out and identifying their own needs. And so it requires us to do more listening than talking. So approach 3, assessing community impacts and needs. Again, it's important for us and policymakers to understand cumulative and cross-cutting impacts of communities. Local governments are encouraged to engage their citizens to identify the priority impacts of concern in each community. Again, it means listening to community needs. An impact assessment is often the initial process of evaluating and estimating future outcomes of actions, usually a decision or policy or regulation. The assessment can focus on future or proposed actions or for existing practices. So it's important for us, again, to not only plan for look at what's happening now, but plan for the future. How do we see climate change impacting these communities 20 to 30 to 40 years out? Approach number 4, developing metrics. I think this is a very important approach. Often it's hard. I would say it's hard for us to sort of measure how well we are sort of engaging with social and racial equity. I think it may be new to some of us to sort of measure sort of the impact. How do we measure if we are positively impacting the work that we do in this area? Does it look like locating more charging stations in a vulnerable community? I would say not really. And the reason why I say that is, vulnerable communities, are they able to use an electric vehicle charging station? Or would the metric look more like more folks in that community have a vehicle if needed? And of course, we are trying to cut down on VMT or vehicle miles traveled, but are they able to use a charging station if it's there? Most community members who are, in these vulnerable areas, they may not have the economic access to use a charging station. So we also have to look at, okay, we have these charging stations here located in these communities. How do we also give them the material ways to actually use these charging stations? Are we providing them with subsidies to, use a car, use a shared vehicle? And so, successful planning for EJ involves a thoughtful method that measures impacts and effectiveness of policy actions. So quality data metrics for evaluating these successes in climate, energy, and air are related to sort of initiatives and actions, and are valuable to not only decision makers, but those on the ground that are actually developing these policies. And approach number 5, providing data, information, resources for communities. Local policymakers are interested in EJ should consider how to collect and disseminate data and information to the community so that it increases the success of our work. Local governments can make data and information available through multiple tools using both online and community-based approaches to help low-income communities. And so with that, I'll say, we learned through COVID that, online is not always the best way for communities. We learned that, vulnerable communities, even in urban and rural areas, don't have access to Wi-Fi. So may require, now that we're sort of somewhat moving out of the pandemic, we need to rethink how we're engaging with communities. Do we need more on the ground ways of communicating? Do we need central points for Wi-Fi access? Do we need, does that mean sort of running cable lines out to certain communities that don't actually have Wi-Fi or efficient access to Wi-Fi? It may mean mapping out certain communities that don't have good access to Wi-Fi. And then how do we find funding to support access to Wi-Fi so they can have access to these, collect data and disseminate data and be a part of the process. So again, going back to my initial sort of my initial thoughts was that it's going to require us to rethink how we engage in this work. Approach number 6, sorry. Using citizen science. This is sort of a new term. Back in 2016, it was considered, a growing field, and I still think it's a growing field. It's a growing field of public participation in scientific research. It allows community members to manage the development of accessible data relevant to environmental and human health that may not be available to that community. And so people living in an impacted neighborhood is ideally situated to observe and monitor pollution that would not only otherwise be detected. it's a collaboration between citizens and volunteers. And so one example of this would be University of Maryland's School of Public Health's Dr. Jacoby Wilson. Hopefully, many of you are familiar with Dr. Wilson, his work that he's doing with the city of Cheverly with their local air quality monitors is something that we should all keep a lookout for, and possibly even emulate in other areas. So again, this is a sort of a collaboration between science and scientists and the community. And approach number 7, developing community leadership. The community leaders are there. You know, it's one thing to say, you know, sort of identify them, but you know, the community leaders are there. They've been doing the work. These are the grassroots organizers that don't get the notoriety that you know, other sort of formations get. Other formations or other work may have more sort of access to funding because they have more people on the ground to support, but the community leaders are there. This will require us, in terms of engaging communities, for government and policymakers to work with these community members and leaders to make culturally relevant decisions in the community. And so that means not only, you know, being aware of what they're doing culturally, but providing them the material and concrete needs to support the work that they're already doing. Community members are at the forefront of the issues. They know what their communities needs are, and you know, my sort of idea of environmental justice and energy justice is supplying the community members the material needs to support their work and providing them the tools to do it. Approach number 8, and we're coming to a conclusion, is supporting economic and workforce development. This again is one of those sort of wraparound, comprehensive ways of looking at environmental justice. You know, an equitable, clean economy improves the environment and, you know, health of underserved communities. It supports economic security of underserved communities. It's a collaborative process, and it can shape sort of the needs of the community, and it can shape the needs of the entire sort of county or even city. And an example of workforce development would be the District of Columbia's Sustainable Energy Utility. COG has been a part of this, or a partner in this program since, I think, 2019. In fact, I think the county has, by way of through COG, our first extern, DCSU extern, Suleiman Almaroof, came through that program to COG, and then I think it's now still with the county on the energy team. So I think sort of looking, that's an example of how economic development and workforce development could work. I think Suleiman is a resident, born and raised in the Washington metropolitan area, in fact, in Prince George's County. And then he's moved back into the area in terms of working through the DCSU program and now with the county. And so I think supporting that sort of work supports the education, equity and education interface. And finally, mainstreaming environmental justice into public planning and programs. the goal of sort of mainstreaming EJ is for it to become a natural part of local decision making. Widening the scope can affect policies and programs. So while mainstreaming is not a standardized process, it can help establish some existing forms and mechanisms for debate and consensus in the common practice. And so all of these sort of approaches, they're not sort of shouldn't be taken as individual approaches. They're all sort of interconnected. So they're all working, in tandem and in connection with one another. And next slide, please. And so these are just some additional tools that could be used through your work. The Energy Justice Network. This tool is a mapping tool that maps out existing, proposed, closed, and deleted fossil energy and waste facilities. I think policymakers can identify affected communities. They can use this work with residents in the community to hear concerns. So this sort of tool, community members can actually use the tool. It's an online tool that again maps out fossil energy and waste facilities. I know you guys were pretty interested in the Maryland EJ screening tool. This tool comes out of University of Maryland School of Public Health. So that's the school where Dr. Jacoby Wilson is. It builds off of EPA's screening tool and California's Enviro tool. This tool combines sort of pollution burden of the community, and it provides demographics to produce an environmental justice score. It's a mapping tool that calculates scores for each census tract, and you can even sort of look by state and by year as well. And I think I skipped over the EJ toolkit. I think the EJ toolkit, the EPA's EJ toolkit has been around for quite a while. It provides a comprehensive national data set that combines environmental demographic indicators. Again, it's a basis for a lot of the toolkits that are used. Specifically, again, is the used for the Maryland Environmental Justice Toolkit. Another tool is Arlington County's Energy Masters program. It's a very interesting program that's been around for a couple years. It helps to train community members and students in terms of energy efficiency, water conservation, and community education. So this sort of points back to training community members, engaging community members so that they have a better voice in terms of crafting their own community needs and environmental needs. And lastly, next slide. These are the last couple tools that I'll sort of go through, but the Energy Equity Project, this is a really very interesting project that we looked at the Built Environment and Energy Advisory Committee. This project endeavors to sort of create a framework for measuring equity across energy efficiency and clean energy programs among utilities, state regulatory agencies, and other practitioners. It was developed out of the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. It started back in 2018, and it expects to, these are pop-ups, thank you. It expects to launch this year, so we hope to sort of engage the Energy Equity Project again. We had a presentation back in, I believe it was in June, through our Built Environment Committee. So we will be using that in terms of updating the environmental toolkit. The Air and Climate Public Advisory Committee, we're looking at that 2017 toolkit and seeing that it needs update. In going through it in preparation for today, some of the tools that were provided in the toolkit are now, some of them are out of date. There's a lot of work that's been online, a lot of funding that's available that we'd like to include in an update of the toolkit. This is one of the things that we'd like to update it with the Energy Equity Project. Another tool is ACEEE's Leading with Equity Initiative. Back in February 2021, the ACEEE kicked off this initiative to convene community-based organizations to define the success of equitable decarbonization. The ACEEE's research and policy outreach will work to develop new policy, and they'll develop metrics for cities, states, utilities, and state transportation, electrification for scorecards. And so this tool may not be particularly useful to the county, as the scorecards are on the state level, and then on the city level. So it has some data or scorecard, for example, for the city of Baltimore, and at the state level for Maryland, but it may not have something specific to the county, but it's still useful in terms of providing metrics or information for the state. And so again, this is not an exhaustive list of tools that can be done or used in your work. There's another sort of area that could be useful is through the Urban Institute's Racial Equity Analytics Lab. The premise of this work is to share sort of data, granular disaggregated data by race and ethnicity. The Urban Institute's work is really looking at advancing racial equity with data principles. That tool is actually not included on the slide there, but I can put it in the chat in terms of the work that they're doing, and sort of the work that they have put forth to the Chief Equity Officers Committee earlier this year. And I think that's my last slide. So I went through a lot of information there. I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Leah, for that wonderful, informative presentation. It's a lot of information to digest, but I do appreciate you giving us that background and overview of equity and available tools to help us assess those vulnerable populations. Before we take questions, and I know we're really limited on time, I know that Andrea had wanted to just kind of give the audience an opportunity to view the MDE EJ screening tool. It is a beta version of the tool, so I'm going to just kind of show it very briefly and show those layers. And of course,
And
Leah.
Donna, I think that link should be, oh, okay, yeah, the link on my presentation would open it up, but you have it there.
Yeah, I pulled it up earlier.
Yeah.
And of course, Leah, you are the expert on EJ here and not me. But I do want to show the area that's covered. It's the entire state of Maryland. Is covered on the MDE EJ screening tool. And as Leah had mentioned before, this tool highlights areas that are deemed EJ areas based on those vulnerable populations for minority population, low income, and low English proficiency. I know at the local level, sometimes we're challenged to figure out where are those low income areas. So with the knowledge information that Leah has shared with us, we can then somewhat comfortably apply this tool to figure out where those low income areas are. And I fear drilling down too far. But again, this layer, this EJ score layer, highlights for us those EJ communities at various levels within Prince George's County. And you can further break down sub-layers to identify areas that are, let's say, poverty, to identify the poverty distribution areas within the county. So I just wanted to let people know that that tool is available to help us look at socioeconomic information at I think this is a census tract level, but yeah.
Yes, it is census tract level.
Mhm.
And
And
just
I was
wanted,
dropping the tools you were mentioning into the chat while you were going. We'll also send those out afterwards, but in case folks wanted to dig into it more quickly, then we provide a sort of list of all the tools. And the nuance between the MDE EJ screening tool and Maryland EJ Screen is that this is the one that the Maryland Department of Environment has decided is how they're going to allocate funding. So we've
Okay.
got a lot of different tools that can give us a lot of different ideas about, you know, how we want to look at communities. I dropped things like the tree equity tool into the conversation as well as the COGS tool, because I think it gives us a vision of what the community looks like, and each tool has different factors that you can hone in on that help where you want to align your core mission of your agency, you know, with the climate work that we're doing. But the kind of critical path thing about this particular tool is that the state of Maryland, under both MDE and now it seems like MEA, has decided that this tool will be the mechanism by which they determine what is an EJ40 community. And so they are likely to put forward action at the executive level to have the definition of an EJ burdened community for the purposes of Justice 40 funding be a community that on this map, under its EJ score as a percentage distribution quantile representation, is 80% or greater. And so that is an important definition that no one needs to remember, and we will go over again later. But which is why we're kind of focusing on this map, because it allows us to look at issues in those communities as places where we are likely to be able to get grant funding from the federal level that is flown through the state level.
All right.
I gotta ask a question.
Sure.
Sure. Can you go back to the map we're just looking at, and go back 2 slides, or go back to the original.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
This one?
Yes, that one.
Mhm.
So here's, and I get, and I maybe just, it kind of looks like, I understand that there's more intensity, but it kind of looks like the whole county is getting, compare, and which is a little hard to, it makes it hard to prioritize, that's all.
Yes, I think when we look at the EJ score in total, comprehensively in aggregate, yes, it looks like the whole county is in that higher quantile percentage or whatever. I'm not sure if I'm getting that right, but when you break it down in different layers, if we look at percent poverty, you'll see that the colors change, right? So the EJ layer takes into consideration minority population, limited English proficiency, and low income. So if we think about our county, it's a high percentage minority population, right? But if we step back and then look at the other factors contributing to the EJ score, that being percent poverty and percent limited English proficiency, we begin to see some variation across the county. It's not all it's not all the same, I guess, across the county, as you see with the EJ score, more or less, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And I think English proficiency and poverty, the distribution is kind of similar. Leah, I don't know if I'm explaining that quite correctly, but
Yes, you are. That was a perfect explanation.
And when you zoom out to the state level, it gives you the picture of where is the state's target areas, right? I mean, we, like Baltimore County, have historic and present issues that are quite clear and obvious. And that's why when you see this map of the state, you really see those areas stand out, with pockets here and there, and in our, the other places that are underinvested in, like the Eastern Shore, right? I don't think that anything about the environmental justice map is surprising to any of us, right? I mean, we know what the history of our community is, and we also know very clearly why this underinvestment happened. It happened because we are at this point, 64% African-American community, but at one time, even higher percentage African-American community. One of the things I dropped in the chat is a great presentation that a professor from Columbia University gave to the county council around why we are where we are and what investment in our community looks like over time versus investment in other similarly situated communities in the area. We may have, until recently, have been the wealthiest African-American, majority African-American county in the country. We are also the least invested in and poorest county in the DMV. So, I mean, it's obvious where this came from. And now, hopefully, we're being given some of the resources that we need to make some impact on it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is Charles County a little bit of an anomaly, and is there things that we could learn from Charles County, or is it different with respect to perhaps being a little bit farther away from, a densely populated city? I'm just curious about Charles County.
yeah, I think Charles County, it is pretty distant from the District of Columbia and more urbanized areas. And I think that just proximity, our proximity to the more urbanized areas puts us Prince George's County, in a bit of a different position than Charles County.
Thank you.
That's just my opinion.
And I would argue that this isn't exactly accurate for Charles County, because I think that one of the things that's underaccounted for in the environmental justice map from Maryland, because of Maryland's biases, is mobility justice, right? There's certainly a mobility justice challenge in a lot of these rural areas that is as, if not more significant than our own, that isn't really accounted for, because folks don't really think about that. They often don't consider the fact that there is not there's not an alternative to car-based transportation in most of the state outside of these more urbanized areas. But folks, we are actually over time, so I really want to thank Leah and the COG for bringing this forward. I know it's a lot to digest. Leah, I'm sorry, and I realized I said that wrong. And I really appreciate everyone taking the time. No one expects you to suddenly become experts on environmental justice. The real goal is for you to start to see, how these things connect to your own portfolios and how we can together as we build this, this climate implementation plan, look at those things. This is an opportunity to take the things that we shout in the streets and move them into real policy, right? Like we've been shouting in the streets for years that mobility justice is climate justice, that racial justice is climate justice, that immigration justice is climate justice. At least I have, and literally yesterday at the World Bank. And so it's nice to be able to kind of see that in a policy framework. And I hope that this was a beginning of all of you seeing that as we are trying to do this climate implementation plan, it is to provide a pathway that supports the core missions of your agencies as much as it looks as a way to, support the core mission, obviously, of the Department of Environment around climate. But this conversation is one that has to be centered on equity, and one that we intend to center on equity and health and housing and clean air and clean water and all of the things that are, the basic human needs that we have denied members of our population and we can no longer stand to do. And, I hope that this is one of the ways that we can together look to get the investment that our county deserves and that our residents deserve, and further all of your missions with that investment, not just a climate mission. So really appreciate all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Look forward to working with you as we progress.
Yes, and if you all just please have any sort of additional things that you'd like us to include. Like I said, there's a lot of things that I didn't get to, like Jeff mentioned, some of the transportation equity work through their Vision 2045 work. They looked at equity in transportation. So it's a lot there, and it can become a bit overwhelming to kind of look at, well, what tools work best for us here, for our region. Maryland and even just Prince George's County in general is a large county that has a lot of sort of rural and urban areas. How do you apply these tools in the right way that are effective? How do we touch base with those existing community leaders that have a voice, that have been doing the work and can inform what the policy makers need to do, and what are those implementation tools that we just need to support them in their existing work and enhance their work.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all. It's been a great session, I think. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good briefing.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.